A date which will live in infamy.
Bais Yaakov and Rav Yaakov. Both of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode, which is the next installment in the Great American Jewish History Cities, Great American City series of Jewish History Soundbites, is about Muncie. We're covering Muncie, and it has been generously sponsored in loving memory of Dr. Sidney and Shirley Levine, tirelessly serving the Muncie community for over 50 years, all the while setting an example in Limud HaTorah, Gemilas Chasadim, and Avas Yisrael to everyone who knew them from their grandchildren. So there will be, covering Muncie, so there will be eventually a part 2, and who knows, maybe even a part 3. So before you join the chorus of how did you not mention this, that, and the other thing, etc., remember that there's plenty of more coming. In part 1, we'll just profile just a few aspects of Muncie personalities and institutions and development, especially since the history in Muncie, which I'm going to get to soon, is so recent. It's really, really modern Jewish history. So it's less chronological and more just profiling specific aspects and people. I know I grew up in Muncie before I moved to Israel. So I remember, we always a big question about Muncie was that is it in town or out of town? We always thought it was in town. We're just up north from the city, and everyone in Muncie worked in the city, took the Muncie Trails bus or whatever, or drove across the George Washington Bridge or the Tappan Zee Bridge to get into Manhattan. And, and people went to Brooklyn and the city to go out to eat and go for Shabbos and stuff. So we considered ourselves pretty in town. But then we went to, you go up to camp in upstate, and all of a sudden we're exposed to the tough guy Brooklyn guys. And they ask you, I remember this happened when I was a little kid. So where are you from? Muncie. Oh, so you live on a farm? And then we discover that we're really out of town because we're in a rural suburban area far away from New York City. So in Orthodox suburbia is to be seen in the larger context of the suburban post-war trends, which is how the community develops post-war. And in fact, it was old farmland. It was considered upstate New York once upon a time. It was only Rockland County. It's still before Orange County, and then Sullivan County, which is real upstate New York. But to a certain extent, it was across the river and way out of the city. So before it was developed, it was very rural. It was actually farmland. Even in my own time, in the 90s, growing up in Wesley Hills and Fort Shea in the 1990s, it was still somewhat suburban. There was no traffic, no sidewalks in those neighborhoods, and there was plenty of parking all over town. It's all distinctive features of suburbia. I remember out on Blauvelt Road, there was old brick buildings that the old timers said were actually part of a farm that used to be in that area. So it definitely was, and that becomes a feature of the development of Muncie and how it becomes less and less suburban, and of course, one of the identifying features of Muncie Jewish history is the zoning and rezoning of those areas as more and more Orthodox Jews move in. When I posted on Twitter that there's going to be a Muncie episode, there was an insane amount of Twitter traffic. I don't think there was anything close to that since I opened the account a few years ago. So obviously this is a popular, all the different people's places and things. So we're going to try to get to a significant amount of them, if not now, then in future installments. But we'll cover the more interesting ones. What's interesting about the history of Muncie is how recent and modern it is. Almost exclusively a post-war story. There is a little bit pre-war. And now it's one of the largest and most prominent Orthodox Jewish communities in the United States. It was a little bit pre-war. There's interesting right outside near Muncie, Harvest Straw, where there was a rabbi, one of the earliest shuls in Rockland County, sons of Jacob, I believe. So there was a rabbi, Rabbi Elimelech Adlin, who during a landslide in 1906, he died. He passed away when he was in the middle of assisting in the rescue of others from the community. And that's he was a European rabbi who had immigrated to the United States and became one of the first congregational rabbis in Rockland County. Harvest Straw is right outside of where Muncie is today. So that's an early Muncie story. Now, in general, I'm talking about the Jewish settlement in the Hudson River Valley, in that whole general area, and specifically in Rockland County. Today, Jews are a third of the population in Rockland. And they came up from the city, the Bronx, Yonkers in the 1930s, and more so in the post-war, and the general move to the suburbs. In 1955, New York State history changed with the opening of the Tappan Zee Bridge over the Hudson River, making it much easier to get there from the city, so that definitely helped in development. So people who are leaving the city looking for bigger homes, looking for yards for their kids, big, huge, massive yards for their kids, and good schools, they came up to those areas. But for the record, Nyack, which is again another place in the outskirts of Muncie, one of the first shul in Rockland County was in Nyack, the Sons of Israel in 1891. The Jews were peddlers and small-time shopkeepers and merchants during that time. And it's situated across the river from Westchester, where there was plenty of Jewish communities dotting the landscape in Westchester who had also left the city. You even have not far across the river in northern Westchester, you have near Peekskill actually, is Mount Kisco, which is fascinating, the Nitra community. Mount Kisco, also a post-war phenomenon, which is not far from Bear Mountain, another Muncie, kind of a Muncie location. It's part of growing up in Muncie, and of course West Point, which is, if you grew up in Muncie, then West Point has to be part of your itinerary on your Chol Hamoed trips. But it's part of, in general, that area, the Hudson River Valley, part of American history in general. It's where Benedict Arnold was supposed to meet Major Andre and to surrender West Point to the British. The Treason House is right outside Muncie, a very historic place, a center of Revolutionary War history. In fact, there is a Revolutionary War cemetery smack in the center of Old Muncie, right there. A tiny little place, but it's right there in the middle. It was across the street from one of the great Torah leaders of Muncie lived, or Mordechai Schwab, who I'll get to. And in fact, he would himself go pick up the garbage that had been dropped there in the Revolutionary War cemetery, because he felt that it would be a Chil Hashem, a desecration of God's name, if right in the middle of a Jewish neighborhood and there was garbage left in the revolution, such a historic veterans Revolutionary War cemetery. So he would clean it up. He himself would go down, or Mordechai Schwab, and clean up the garbage there, it's really right there, right next to Bais Shraga, the Yeshiva in Muncie. So there's historical significance in the area, and if you looking over if you stand in West Point, you look over one of the places. I remember we used to go and overlooking one of the areas where those old cannons are, and you're overlooking the Hudson River, and it's absolutely gorgeous. The whole valley is open in front of you in the mountainous area, and it's beautiful, and you can almost see J.P. Morgan going with his yacht up from his city estate on Fifth Avenue, going up to where he had his place in Westchester and the Revolutionary War and all that. It's a center of American history as well. So as far as the Jews are concerned, it's definitely unique. Most cities that we cover in this series of Great American Jewish cities are either areas in and around New York City, the neighborhoods and suburbs of New York City, or other major United States or Canadian cities which developed a Jewish history over time as well. Here we have a suburb of New York. It's not a major city, and that somehow it evolved into a major Jewish and Orthodox center. Muncie in the Orthodox context is not limited to the place called Muncie. It includes Kaiser Village, which is Vizhnitz, smack in the middle of Muncie. It includes New Hempstead, Wesley Hills, Suffern, Spring Valley, Chestnut Ridge, today even New City and Airmont, Pomona, who knows? Maybe one day even Nanuet will be considered part of Muncie as well. A few other towns and villages in the area. So everything in Muncie is all about zoning and getting the zoning, and each village has their own zoning. It's officially the town of Ramapo, not even Muncie. Muncie's not incorporated. We'll get to that also. There was a prominent non-Orthodox Jewish history in the area, conservative, reform, and unaffiliated, very prominent in and around Rockland County. It was a Reuben Gittleman school, Solomon Schechter school. There was a Camp Ramah, one of the most prominent Camp Ramahs in the country was in the area. Very large Jewish population in general, non-Orthodox or even unaffiliated, but oftentimes very developed institutionally, as are many of the towns on both sides of the river in the counties leading north from the city. But when we talk about the Orthodox development in Muncie, the reason that it happened and the way it developed is due to one person and his vision, and that is, like many other things in the Torah history of the United States of America in general, and that's Rav Shraga Feivel Mendlowitz and his building of Bais Medrash Elyon, and that lays the real foundations of Torah Jews in Muncie without a doubt, without a question. He brings in the great leaders of Torah leaders to become the heads of Bais Medrash Elyon, Reuven Grozovsky and Chaim Kaplan, the son-in-law of the Mir Meshgiach Rabbi Yochanan Lubavitz. He brings it to the Meshgiach and Bais Medrash Elyon, and Rav Shraga Feivel Mendlowitz's influence is seen beyond just Bais Medrash Elyon, although that was his main contribution. He had many other things as well, some of which I'll get to. His son-in-law, Reb Dov Greenbaum, started Yeshiva of Spring Valley, which also I'll get to, the first day schools, the first day school in Muncie, and even some of the stores in Muncie, Mendlowitz's, the supermarkets and butchers and stuff, are started by members of his family. And of course, Bais Shraga, the main yeshiva in Muncie till today, is named for Rav Shraga Feivel as well. And his family remained very influential even after his passing, which was not long after he pioneered the Muncie Jewish life. In those days, it was a little more in Spring Valley. It was Young Israel there in the early years, actually, which I believe still exists. But it developed into Muncie pretty early on. One of the things that I remember most about Muncie was another historical landmark, which is not related to the Jewish community, but it was again a feature of American history, is the drive-in theater, which was a major part of American history. I thought it had a lot of potential in the 1950s with the big American cars that were being developed at the time, people coming in to drive in and watch movies in an outdoor theater, which is the reason I thought of it is because there was a kind of a resurgence of the idea of a drive-in last year during Corona. There was drive-in rallies and drive-in concerts and drive-in entertainment, but that was the abandoned lot of the drive-in theater. We would see it when we would drive to the Atrium Plaza next door, or more often to get Chinese food next door in one of the stores. Real piece of American small-town history. One of the early, like I said, Spring Valley, in the early development, one of the early people and families who were involved there were the Soloveitchiks of Muncie. So Muncie had their own Soloveitchiks as well. Especially Rebbetzin Shoshana Soloveitchik and girls' education, girls' school, Bais Yaakov, but also her husband. It goes back a few generations. The Beis Halevi, the original patriarch of the Soloveitchik dynasty, rabbinical dynasty. They really started even earlier than the Beis Halevi. He's the first famous one. So he had 3 wives. His first one got divorced. The second one, where most of his children are from, such as his famous one, Reb Chaim Brisker. But he had a third marriage also after his second wife's passing. He had a son and a daughter from his third marriage, and the youngest son was Reb Simcha Soloveitchik, who was a Rav in Moilov, which is a town in Belarus, east of Minsk. Later, he immigrated to the United States, and he was a rabbi in New York, in the city. And he passed away in 1941 and is buried in the Mount Judah Cemetery. And he had a son named, a very prominent Soloveitchik family name, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, named after his grandfather. So you have many Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchiks, but this is the one in Muncie. And he was a rabbi in Spring Valley, in one of the first shuls in the area. And his wife, Rebbetzin Shoshana Soloveitchik, was an aristocratic woman. And she was the longtime legendary principal and educator in the Bais Yaakov in Spring Valley, Muncie. She passed away at the age of 90 in the year 2000. Very influential and a big impact on generations of girls' education, a pioneer essentially of Bais Yaakov education in the area. Their son, by the way, is Rabbi Yitzchak Soloveitchik, who was a prominent Rosh Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. So you have Rav Shraga Feivel and his influence. He starts Bais Medrash Elyon. He also had other programs. He had the Eish Dus Educators program, which was in the early days of Torah Messiah. Reb Simcha Wasserman, the son of Rabbi Chanan, actually was there for a time. And like I said, even before Bais Medrash Elyon opens, already Yeshiva of Spring Valley, started by the son-in-law of Rav Shraga Feivel, opens in 1943. It's the first day school in the area, one of the first in the country, actually. In 1943, Yeshiva Spring Valley started in the basement of Rabbi Soloveitchik's synagogue, who I just mentioned, with just a few students. Until then, everyone had gone to public school, and they had to canvass the locals to send their children to the day school. The school so they start in Rabbi Soloveitchik's shul, and then they spent a year in Bais Medrash Elyon, and then they rented space in a chicken factory, in a local chicken factory. And then until eventually they were able to buy a piece of property in the corner of Main Street and Maple Avenue, which it was for many, many decades. It was when I was there. There were not many families in the area who cared about Jewish education. So there was a fellow named Harry Halberg, who was the son of Bracha Halberg, who sold the Bais Medrash Elyon estate to Rav Shraga Feivel Mendlowitz. So he would go door to door asking Jewish families to please send their children to the school, and he would convince them that they would get a general education as well. Unbelievable, just to get things started in those early days. And many of the early Rebbeim of Yeshiva Spring Valley came from the alumni of Bais Medrash Elyon, students of Rav Shraga Feivel, one of the most prominent ones, legendary, historical ones. Who became one of the most famous people in Muncie was Rav Hershel Mashinsky, who I had the privilege of knowing, actually, in his later years. And he was a Rebbe in the Yeshiva Spring Valley for well over a half a century, a student of Rav Shraga Feivel, who would speak about him. And it was the first time I ever heard someone speak about him, as someone who knew him. And he had gone to the Eish Dus Educators program that Rav Shraga Feivel had started there. And then he went to become a prominent educator and stayed there for the rest of his life. And then Reb Dov Greenbaum is the principal. So Reb Dov Greenbaum used to open the telephone book and dial the number of any family whose name sounded Jewish, and then try to convince them to join the school. And it would even offer them tuition breaks, and that's how Yeshiva Spring Valley is built. And of course, another historical event there took place when the future podcaster of Jewish History Soundbites spent a decade there in the 1990s. But Bais Shraga eventually was started by members of Rav Shraga Feivel's families. It became a prominent yeshiva there. Rav Shia Schiff, Rav Shraga Feivel, another son-in-law, a few of his own children and grandchildren, the Mendlowitzes. In the same area, there was another historic shul, the Beis Yisrael Shul, who's the rabbi there, who was I believe a Holocaust survivor, Rav Nosson Horowitz, who was one of the elder poskim of of Muncie for many years. I used to daven there at the 8 o'clock minyan on Sunday morning, and they would give out l'chaims then after davening. So I remember the old shul there had this old oak wood smell, which made you feel like you were in a shtetl. And it was right across the street from Bais Medrash Elyon in Yeshiva Valley, right down the block from Bais Shraga. This is the center of old Muncie. So we get back to Bais Medrash Elyon and how that began. And I have to thank my good friend Srili Besser for sharing a bunch of stories with me and in articles that he's written about Bais Medrash Elyon and the old Muncie of those times, and allows me to encourage me to quote from and cite what he's written on the topic. So thank you, Srili. Now the Bais Medrash Elyon didn't just build a yeshiva; they built the original bungalows, kind of like little houses for the first kollel residences in U.S. history. These were the first kollel families who had their own homes, which was part of Rav Shraga Feivel's vision. He had been the principal in Torah V'das for many years, and he believed that the Torah V'das out in Williamsburg would provide Shomer Shabbos balabatim, laymen. And he decided at some point that it's time to move it to the next level, a real yeshiva which would provide rabbis, Rosh Yeshiva, Paiskim, big Talmidei Chacham, and he chose Muncie. He wanted it to be out of town, and he bought the estate. He brought Reb Reuven Grozovsky, the son-in-law of Rabbi Baruch Ber, the Rav Kamenetsky, to become the Rav Bais Medrash Elyon. He brought Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Kaplan, the son-in-law of Rabbi Yochanan Levavitz, to be the Mashgiach. He brought his own product, Rabbi Gedalia Shor, from Torah V'das, to become one of the heads of the yeshiva as well. And then 40 American students from Brooklyn and the Lower East Side to create the basis of what would become the premier yeshiva of America at that time. One of the early members of the kollel was a fellow by the name of Reb Eliezer Lauer. He and other members would sometimes donate some of their meager kollel checks back to Bais Medrash Elyon, which was a cash-strapped institution at the time, going through difficult financial straits. And when Reb Eliezer Lauer would donate it, it would always be a random number. And he was asked why he gave such funny numbers. Why couldn't he round it up or down? He said he would calculate the minutes he wasted that month and return the equivalent amount that he felt that he owed back to the yeshiva. And some of the alumni of Bais Medrash Elyon during those early years was Rav Simcha Shostel, who went on to become the head of the kollel in Bais Medrash Elyon, and his two sons, prominent Rosh Yeshiva today, studied there as well. Rav Donan Garisher was the son-in-law of Rav Reuven Grozovsky, and later became the Yeshiva Bais Medrash Elyon. Rabbi Moshe David Steinwurzel, Rabbi Mottele Weinberg, Rabbi Yaakov Kalevsky, Rabbi Hershel Moshinsky, who I mentioned before, Rabbi Shmelka Taubenfeld, who was a Galicia Belz Chassid and Holocaust survivor who became a close student of Rabbi Reuven Grozovsky. So it's really bringing different worlds together as well. Of course, Rabbi Hirsch Goldworm, Nosson Sherman from Art Scroll, Bisrael Belsky, the late Rosh Yeshiva Torah V'das, and more and more. Professor Aaron Twersky, the Munkatcher Rebbe, the current Munkatcher Rebbe. And the idea was to create a senior yeshiva like Torah V'das, but more serious and older and higher level, no general studies, etc. But that with the combination that Rav Shraga Feivel felt was an ideal in Torah V'das, which was combining the Lithuanian Torah style of Torah study with together with the warmth of Hasidus. And it flourished in the 1950s and 60s. Unfortunately, it closed in the 1970s, but then it reopened a few years later by Reb Reuven's son-in-law, Reb Donan Garisher, and his son later opened a branch of Bais Medrash Elyon in Bnei Brak. The yeshiva custodian for many years was a fellow named Johnson. Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Kaplan, who was the Mashgiach, was still immersed in the world of Mir, which he came from, and he saw some students huddling and talking once on a fine November day in 1963. So he asked what happened. So they said, Kennedy was shot. So he said, who's going to be the president now? So they said, Johnson. So he said, amazing, I just saw him 10 minutes ago. And he couldn't believe it. So that's a Bais Medrash Elyon story. This Reb Shmuel Shmelka Taubenfeld that I mentioned earlier, he eventually had his own shul in the area for many years, which continues till today in Muncie, Bais Medrash Charedim, and other local institutions that grew out of Bais Medrash Elyon as well. Reb Hershel Moshinsky, who I mentioned, also started one of the early tzedakah organizations, Kupas Ezra. One of the most important features that's important to understand about Muncie is there's up the hill and down the hill. Until today, I'm not really sure where it starts and ends, the up the hill and down the hill. And since there's 5,000 hills in Muncie, why specifically that hill? But down the hill emerged from Spring Valley, which started earlier, and then up the hill was developed later on. So now that we have the distinction of Bais Medrash Elyon and other institutions, and we know that there's the up the hill and down the hill. Now I'm going to profile for a few minutes of some other famous Muncie personalities and other institutions. One of them, unforgettable, was a fellow by the name of Ronnie Greenwald, and also his brother actually lived there as well, Dr. Yaakov Greenwald, who was one of the early religious psychologists in the area. But Ronnie Greenwald, who came to, he's really a fascinating story in his own right, and not just limited to his Muncie activities, but he lived there from early on in Muncie, and he redefined what askanas is, what activism is, education, initiative, leadership, and he was very active in Soviet Jewry. He was involved in the release of Natan Sharansky and Anatoly Sharansky back in the 1980s. He negotiated the release of Jewish prisoners around the world. That became one of his main projects in some very harrowing situations and in dangerous countries. Suffice to say that he's a story of his own, but in the Muncie context, he was responsible for the building and sustaining of many of the local institutions, including pioneering endeavors in girls' education, handicapped, special needs, kids at risk, whatever that means, and as that term came to be developed and take on new meanings, abuse victims, he was a pioneer in that respect as well. And of course, with the long time, he was very close with the beloved representative in the House, the congressman for what everyone in Muncie loved for many years, Ben Gilman, who was the son of Austrian Jewish immigrants who served the district in the House for 3 decades. So what an interesting aspect of Ronnie Greenwald's activism is relevant to my trips to Europe. One of his rescue missions, which brought him to Lithuania, which ostensibly was for another Jew held in captivity, he discovered books and Sifrei Torah in tatters in a basement of a monastery in Vilna. And the first book he opened belonged to Rebbe Meir Bloch, who was his Rebbe in Telz. So he rescued them and sent them to shuls around the world following restoration, and others he buried in a plot right near the Vilna Gaon in the Vilna Jewish cemetery. One of the most prominent individuals who graced his presence in Muncie for many years was Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and he sort of retired in his old age. He left Torah V'das, but he didn't really retire because he became even more active when he moved to Muncie. He moves there from Williamsburg and he's quite old and is already the late 60s, early 70s, and he moves out of Williamsburg to Muncie, one of the greatest Torah leaders to have ever resided in the town. So he acclimates himself to Muncie areas. I remember reading a story about how it was Halloween night, and locals, it was mostly non-Jews in the area, had come to trick or treat, and one of the people in Rabbi Yaakov's house was going to explain to him what trick or treating is and what Halloween is. So he should know how to react and how to respond. And then Rabbi Yaakov said, Halloween, I'm all prepared. He knew all about it, and he and his wife had pekalach all prepared to give out to the trick-or-treaters, have them ones who would be anticipated them coming. All the local rabbis and lay people sought out his advice. He oversaw the opening of several of Muncie's schools and yeshivas and institutions. Till today, the flourishing of Torah institutions of all kinds, and many of them are to his direct credit, and he oversaw their opening and initial stages. I actually just heard another story just a week ago from someone who was accompanying Rabbiakov Kaminetsky when he was walking out, and he was already older, and he was leaning on him. It's difficult for him to walk, and he said, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to pay my electric bill and his gas bill, whatever, his utilities. So he said, I'll go pay them for you. You can stay home. So he said, what do you mean? It's a mitzvah to go pay a debt. So I'm going to pay my bills. It's a mitzvah. I want to do it myself. And he lived out on Saddle River Road, which eventually his house became the Gerish Shtibel. I remember the Pnei Menachem, or Pinchas Menachem Alter, the Ger Rebbe, his Levaya was they had a hookup. I'm sorry, not his Levaya, it was in Yerushalayim, but they had a live hookup to his funeral, which I remember also from growing up in 1996. People would come to Rabbi Yaakov's house from all over seeking his sage advice, and in his later months and years, he lived up to his reputation as he was known as Chakima de Yehudoi, the wise man of the Jewish people. I remember Rabbi Wein telling me saying how he guided him against many detractors of his when he opened his school, Sharei Torah, and then he opened his shul, Bais Torah. He had general studies in this school, and he had a smicha program in the school, and he had all kinds of people who were upset, and that was part of the up the hill, down the hill politics of those days, and Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky backed him up and helped him open the institutions, the Torah institutions that he did. And such was with many Muncie institutions of that time. Another prominent individual who lived there at the time was Rav Mordechai Schwab. Rav Mordechai Schwab was the younger brother of Rav Shimon Schwab, the older brother of Rav Moshe Schwab, who was the Mashgiach in Gateshead. So he had come from Frankfurt and studied for 3 years in the Mir Yeshiva in Poland, and later 7 years in the Kamenetz, a close student of Rav Baruch Ber. I actually remember him in Muncie. I met him several times. As a young child, I even held the door open for him when he arrived at some event, and that was my first-hand experience with someone who was like a big tzaddik or whatever. So that left an impression on me personally as well. And he was the mashgiach at Bais Shraga. He was a very sweet and modest, a beautiful smile, sense of humor, and yet he was also a very serious Bal Musar. In fact, I heard a story from someone related a story to me that his father had this fellow who told me the story. His father had his a relative of mine had attempted to send Rav Mordechai Schwab. He knew him from Frankfurt. He knew the family from Frankfurt. He was a Yeki and already settled down in New York City, running away from Hitler and the Nazi regime in the 1930s. And he attempted to assist Rav Mordechai Schwab when he was stuck in Japan to get him a visa to the United States. His visa did not work out. It didn't materialize, and Rav Mordechai Schwab ended up in Shanghai with the Mir Yeshiva. But he attempted to save him. So many years later, when they were living in Muncie, so he once brought his daughter to shul on Hoshana Rabbah, to the shul where Rav Mordechai Schwab davened, and his daughter wanted to receive a blessing after davening on Hoshana Rabbah from Mordechai Schwab. So he asked Mordechai Schwab if he could come over to the ladies section, to the edge there, and he said, "Can you give my daughter a blessing?" So he said, "Of course. It's to the granddaughter of the one who tried to save my life and send me a visa. So how can I refuse? This is just the minimum, the gratitude that I can extend." And a year later, the next daughter wanted a blessing from Mordechai Schwab. Her older sister got it also. So the next year, on Hoshana Rabbah, he brought the next daughter, and he went over to him again, and he said, "My next daughter wants a blessing." So he said, "Of course, the granddaughter of the one who, or great-granddaughter, whatever it was, who had attempted to save my life, that's the minimal gratitude I can give, is to graciously give a blessing." So that was the extent of his gratitude. So he escaped, like I said, to Japan and Shanghai, where he was again affiliated with the Mir. And upon arrival in the United States, he actually worked as a bookkeeper in the wine business, and he struggled to support his family. He then became a second-grade Rebbe in Williamsburg before he got a teaching position, a similar teaching position, in a early Muncie Cheder of Rafal Eisenberg. And he was soon appointed to the 9th grade position as a Rebbe in Bais Shraga, which later evolved into a full-time mashgiach position. His davening was legendary. It would take a long time with intense recital and concentration. He would sometimes actually have a cup of coffee before he would recite the bedtime Shema. If he felt that he did not have enough focus and concentration because he was tired, so he would have a cup of coffee so he can recite the Shema properly. He was also, one time, another story I saw was he was upset when the handyman who came to fix his house in Muncie was paid in cash, because then he was not able to pay the sales tax, and he was also concerned that the handyman would not report his income tax. He felt it was dishonest. Like I said, he would pick up the garbage in the Revolutionary War cemetery across the street from his house. When he left the hospital shortly before his passing, he sent a box of candy to all the nursing staff to express his appreciation. To a certain extent, he was seen as the successor to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky as the senior rabbinical figure in Muncie. He convinced many Muncie schools to add the study of the Sefer Chafetz Chaim and Shmiras HaLashon to their curriculum, and he later considered that the greatest accomplishment of his life. So that's a pretty incredible accomplishment. One of the suburbs of Muncie, one of the nearby towns, as part of Muncie history, is the town of New Square. When the Skver Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, wanted to leave Williamsburg, New York City, and to get out in 1954, they bought this piece of property and then eventually started to become populated in 1956. They incorporated as a village in 1960. They even had their own mayor. A fellow by the name of Matis Freisel became the mayor in 1961, and he ran unopposed in every election until his passing in 2015. So he has the distinction of being one of the longest-serving mayors in the history of the United States. So the idea of starting this little shtetl, really, to talk about Skver and the dynasty and New Square and the town and the Skver Rebbe, the previous Skver Rebbe, and I think it's a nice piece of history on its own, but it also has its relation to Muncie, and many of the overflow, many members have eventually moved into Muncie itself, so it's definitely a part of history. Especially we would walk, when I was a kid growing up, we would walk over an hour on Simchas Torah night to participate in the hakafis of New Square. So that was something that was part of it. And I remember we went to the Simchas Bais Yaakov on Chol Hamoed Sukkos, and we would see this young teenager Skvera Chassid named Lipa Schmelzer singing at the Simchas Bais Yaakov before he was famous. So it definitely has a Muncie history there as well. In fact, the Dayan of New Square, Rav Moshe Neuschloss, who was ostensibly the Dayan of New Square, he was the respected senior Paisik from Muncie and many Muncie rabbis for decades. He was an Oberlander, a Hungarian Jew, who survived the Holocaust and later built up a following in New Square in Muncie. Speaking of the Hasidic presence in Muncie, we come to Vizhnitz. Rav Mordechai or Mottele, Hager. We have to do a Vizhnitz episode about the dynasty one day, but specifically in regards to Vizhnitz in Muncie. So the Rebbe, after escaping the Holocaust with his family, his father, the Rechaim of Vizhnitz, and his brother, the future Vizhnitz Rebbe in Bnei Brak, they lived before the war, of course, in Grossvardian, and they escape across the Romanian border to Bucharest, and then they return. He returns to Grossvardian after the war, where he teaches Torah to young refugees, but he soon goes ahead and marries the daughter of the Skver Rebbe, Rabbiakov Kaminetsky, in Bucharest, in the capital. And she passed away shortly afterwards, and he marries her sister. So he moves to the United States following his father-in-law, not his father, to Israel, and he settles in Borough Park and later in Williamsburg, and he establishes a Vizhnitz shtibel. And aside from his father-in-law, he's also close with the Satmarav, who influenced his views on many issues of the day. And in 1964, eager to get out of the city and following the model of his father-in-law, who had a decade earlier established New Square, he moves to Muncie, right nearby, and establishes a community of Vizhnitz. So this is while his father is still alive. He's not yet the Vizhnitz Rebbe. The Rechaim is still alive in Bnei Brak at this time. This is a community, a kehila. So it's very interesting. Later, he established a yeshiva and a small community in Kiamisha Lake in upstate New York. But he incorporated his own village in Muncie in the 1990s, Kaiser Village, Crown, Kesser. And this village, which is completely surrounded by Muncie, has the distinction of having the highest Romanian ancestry of any town in the United States. Of course, there was the local shtiblach. We always davened there in the Vizhnitz Bais Medrash growing up. And it was only incorporated for zoning purposes, that village, because it was really part of Muncie, to be able to have multifamily dwellings and stuff and so on. So that was my first exposure to Hasidus and a Tish and a Rebbe growing up, was the Vizhnitz Muncie Rebbe. He himself would go below the shofar by his father, the Imre Chaim of Vizhnitz and Bnei Brak, and following his passing in 1972, he officially became the Vizhnitz Muncie Rebbe. Later, he took in his nephew, who's the current Vizhnitz Rebbe in Bnei Brak, Reb Srulcha, when he was banished from his father's home, and that was a lot of Vizhnitz politics in those days, so he lived in Muncie for close to 20 years in the 80s and 90s. There was lots of tension between the two courts of Bnei Brak and Muncie, and eventually it was resolved. Also, Rav Mottele, the Vizhnitz Muncie Rebbe, was considered more of a kanoi, but of an extremist, while in Israel, the Vizhnitz is part of the Agudas Yisrael. But ultimately they made peace, and the Vizhnitz Rebbe is buried in Muncie. In fact, the Toldasaran Rebbe, the current Toldasaran Rebbe, lived in Muncie for a period of time as well. One of the most important early institutions in Muncie was Rabbi David Tendler and the community synagogue. Up the hill. The Up the Hill community started with that in the late 1950s. And Rabbi Tendler already lived in Muncie at the time, and they asked him to become the rabbi. And I heard from one of his grandchildren that he didn't want to become the rabbi. He had a position in Yeshiva University. He was close with his father-in-law, Rav Moshe. He was busy. He didn't want to take on to be the rabbi in the community synagogue. And Rav Moshe, his father-in-law, told him, you're anyways going to live there, and you're anyways going to have to daven in the shul because you need a shul to daven in. So it's always going to be awkward if you're the one who refused to be the rabbi, but you still daven in the shul. So you might as well become the rabbi. So based on that advice, he became the rabbi in the community synagogue and built it up to the massive community that it is today. So one of the prominent builders of the Monsey Orthodox Jewish community was definitely the role that Rabbi Tendler and later his son, New Hempstead, played in the community synagogue. From the Monsey Orthodox community, from several hundred families in the 1960s, eventually grows into several thousand overall, the whole Monsey, not just in the community synagogue, over several decades. Of course, Sharei Torah and Bais Torah, Rabbi Wine, which hopefully I'll get to more in part 2. I want to end off with a fascinating story that I saw in one of Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's books, an article that he wrote about writing the first get in Muncie. Now, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who is not a Muncie personality, he lived in Brooklyn and other places also throughout his unfortunately short but fascinating life. He's an amazing personality himself, but one of his less well-known essays that he wrote was about the first get written in Muncie, and he goes into incredible detail of the process. I found it very interesting. He published the article in the Jewish Observer in December 1976, and he heard the story from Reb Leib Landsman, who was a prominent early Muncie rabbi, and the Kollel Rabbanim was an important Torah institution in Muncie during that time. In 1973, this Kollel Rabbanim decided it's high time to establish the writing of a get in Muncie instead of going in to New York City each time that a get needs to be written. They approached Rabbiakov Kaminetsky, who was living in Muncie then, and advised them that it's time to put Muncie on the Gittin map as well. And they then presented the whole case to Rav Moshe Feinstein, who signed off on it, essentially. They had to establish the correct spelling of Muncie, the body of water as an identifying mark, the precise boundaries of Muncie. Muncie is unincorporated, so it's tricky to establish the boundaries. Rabbi Yaakov advised them using a census map and a postal map. So, and then they had to go on to the spelling. So Muncie was named for the Muncie Native American tribe who inhabited the area, and it also, the name actually first appeared on a local train station, which put Muncie on the map for real. So the question was how to spell it in Hebrew. That was one issue they had to deal with. And then the closest thing to a water source was Lake Suzanne. I guess the Willow Tree Duck Pond in my neighborhood in Wesley Hills didn't qualify. But Rav Moshe was consulted, and they decided to call it Nahar Lake Suzanne, the Lake Suzanne River, and then the Water of Wells, which was the water source for the town. So Rav Moshe wrote out this exact in his own handwriting to finalize the official language of any future get to be written in Muncie. And then they had to get approval from other rabbis. That was the next hurdle. Many hesitated. Reb Chatzkel Roth, the Satmar Dayan, was the first one to jump aboard, though he had an issue with referring to Muncie as a masa, as a city. So apparently when you're a Paisik who's living in Brooklyn, it's hard to see Muncie as a city, but ultimately he decided that for suburbia it sufficed that it was a city. And Rav Moshe Stern, the Rebbetzin Rav, signed off on it. Rav Moshe Neuschloss, of course, of New Square, and Rav Nosson Horowitz, who I mentioned earlier, the senior Muncie Rav, who spoke at my bar mitzvah actually, he agreed to it as well. And then the first get was written in Muncie on October 29th, 1975. So that became a piece of Muncie history. Of course, one of the early shuls was Reb Shlomo Breslauer and Beis Tefillah, which was the original Yaki shul of Muncie. It was a tremendous Paisik. But later on, KHA, Kalash Shurin of Washington Heights, attempted to open, it did not really work out that well, but it was some sort of attempted to open a branch. Eventually, Rav Tully Friedler was a rabbi there of the community when everyone was leaving the small and crowded community of Washington Heights. Not everyone, but many were leaving the small and crowded community of Washington Heights in the 1970s. Muncie's kind of close to Washington Heights area, right across by the George Washington Bridge and up into New York State. So we'll hold it there for now. We'll keep the rest for part 2 and maybe part 3, and be in touch with me for sponsorships about that if you're interested in getting different aspects of Muncie history covered. This is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.